because we love you. That's why we're beating you. This way of thinking contributed significantly to enabling a political demagogue like Hitler to rise. So the child rearing practices created a context that made possible the atrocities of Hitler's Third Reich. In this case, the abuse of children that was condoned and considered normal had widespread political ramifications. So as an aside, there's also a lot of evidence that many of the people who have extremist views of all kinds, including white supremacists, have had histories of child abuse. So anyway, I found similar connections in the communities I studied, that collective trauma, and particularly the prevalence of child abuse, is associated with social violence and economic stagnation. There's actually a Harvard Magazine article that came out in 2008 that describes some of that work. I think my daughter's going to put the link to the article in the chat box for those interested in learning more.
Wonderful.
So as an aside, I want to mention that my passion for healing trauma was never just some professional cerebral undertaking, but early on, because it became deeply personal. At the time, I began researching communities stuck in cycles of poverty and violence. Coincidentally, I had begun to have children, and I was becoming increasingly aware of my own personal and family patterns. And I was seeing that some of those patterns, perhaps they were in exaggerated form in the communities I was researching, but I was also becoming aware of them, in myself and those around me. And I was really powerfully committed to not letting that transmit over another generation.
Wow.
So that was some of the story behind my interest in I think part of that you might know is I'm also Zoroastrian, as you said, Iranian by birth. We have a community that experienced atrocities over a span of 1,400 years. And I was married at the time to someone who was Jewish, whose mother survived Nazi Germany, and whose father came out of the Russian pogroms, family came out of the Russian pogroms. So here I was awakening to my own personal traumatic history, but as well the histories of three traumatic people who've been traumatized, indigenous peoples who I was researching, Zoroastrian Iranians, and European Jews. And it was like a perfect storm. And it took me years to integrate the wisdom they offered, just to say that what I'm sharing about trauma and healing is a result not only of my academic research and work with clients, but also from my own lived experience. And that's the book that you mentioned, Free Me to Love, describes that journey of healing myself and the collective trauma as well.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that background. So it is related after all.
Absolutely.
Yes. We tend to get gravitated to what we need anyway, right? So my first technical question is, I kind of like to address the elephant in the room and just talk in general about healing in our society and perhaps the stigma that's around that. Some people might think, oh, if we're doing healing work, inner child work, then we must be broken. There must be something wrong with us, right? Or it indicates vulnerability. So no, I don't want to touch that. Can we address that? Do you think as a society, we need to change our attitude about healing in general?
Oh, we sure do. I mean, part of it is that when someone abuses another person, they act shamelessly, meaning that they usually don't feel any shame for their acts because they're cut off from their capacity to feel empathy. Ironically, it's the child and the people they have abused that can end up carrying the shame. It's actually referred to as carried shame. So shame is at the heart of abuse, and the shame keeps us from discussing what was done to us, a shame that isn't ours anyway. It's not just that we think we're broken or damaged goods, but we blame ourselves and think it was somehow our fault and that we're irreparable. So shame keeps us often from seeking healing and stigmatizing just the whole process. That's actually why I decided to write the book I did, My Own Journey, because in part to take the stigma out of the issue and to demonstrate that trauma does not have to define us. We're not our wounds. We're much more than our wounds, and our wounds can heal. And the only way to free ourselves and the next generation from its effects is to have the courage to bring the issues to awareness and stop the cycles.
Yes, I absolutely agree. Actually, I think people who choose that, the path of healing are courageous. They've gone past their, oh, no, I don't want other people to find out about me. And they're off to the next stage. So Susan John, this is not a question but a comment. One of the ways you help people is through leadership and life coaching. In fact, that's how we met, right? After 20 years in corporate America, I was feeling totally fulfilled with my career. I'm sharing this with everyone else on the call too. So my career wasn't really giving me any kind of any sense of fulfillment, and so I reached out to Susan, looking for a prescription, instructions. Tell me what to do, and I will do it, and I will find my best career in life. Right? We all wish that there was a manual like that. And Susan gently just guided me to turn my attention inwards, and through that process I did some healing myself, and I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And so basically what I'm trying to say here is really going back to the last question. There's nothing wrong with healing. Actually, there is some courage involved in this. And from the famous Persian poet Rumi, he says, everyone sees the unseen in proportion to the clarity of their own heart. And the clarity depends on how much he has polished the mirror of his heart. Whoever has polished it more sees more. And in turn, more unseen forms will manifest. This is a beautiful, beautiful quote from Rumi about clarity in general, right? In order for us to get clarity, we need to have a clear mirror. And that's kind of like what I see in the healing process. So please keep a curious mind and maybe an open heart for the next remainder of the hour. My next question, Susanja, I'm going to ask you to dive into the inner child work and tell us kind of like how is it as a healing modality, and is it for everyone? What if someone had a completely normal childhood, and can they still benefit from doing the inner child work?
Well, just to say that what's so interesting about our experience together when I was coaching, the coaching work we did together, is that you obviously hired me to work with you moving forward on your passion to build the healing center that you're going to build. And this often happens with the work I do with people, is we discover that some of what's in our way are the limiting beliefs that arise from our childhood, that we have to clear away, as you so beautifully said with Rumi's mirror, that the limiting beliefs sometimes are there that are in the way. So that's where the inner child work comes in. And here I'm going to start with your last question first. I think you asked, can anyone benefit from inner child work? Here's the thing: if you've had even what you may consider a relatively healthy childhood, being in touch with the younger aspects of ourselves can help us get back in touch with the openness, innocence, magic, passion, and creativity that we had as a child, but that many of us have lost along the way. So really, anybody can benefit from accessing their inner child. Now let's just step back and explore your use of the word normal, which I think is really interesting. Remember that Alice Miller pointed out that child-rearing ethos of Germany, of beating children and withholding affection, was considered normal in the early part of last century. It would not be considered normal now in Germany. So what's considered normal in the last generation may no longer be considered optimal in ours. The second book I've written is all about how some forms of childhood abuse are culturally sanctioned, meaning that trauma and abuse are considered normal in various cultures. In some places or family systems, withholding affection and beating children are still considered normal. In some cultures around the world, incest and molestation of children are considered normal. In some, the cutting away of a girl's genitals is considered normal. So many people think they don't need to look at their childhood because they consider their childhood normal. I wasn't beaten or sexually abused, they might say. My parents were loving to me. So they don't realize that some of the ways they may feel stuck or caught in self-destructive patterns, and some of the suffering they're experiencing as adults may still come from childhood experiences that are worth examining, no matter how normal they may seem. So you don't have to have experienced really horrendous abuse, to experience have had some negative effects. For example, everyday verbal put downs, humiliations, bullying, sometimes by older siblings, not just parents, can be crushing. So part of the doing the inner child work is questioning what we consider normal and tapping into what it was really like in those moments when we were children, the fear, the humiliation we might have felt, the beliefs we made up as a result. So now, as you said, we made bulk at doing the healing work. It can be a painful reckoning, though it's more painful actually to bottle it all up. So we may resist healing, not only because it requires us to become aware of what was done to us by people we love and who love us, but also we must be willing to acknowledge what we ourselves have done to others out of those wounded places. So what is inner child work, and why is it important to look at our childhood? So inner child work is really in part about getting access to what we experienced as children and how we felt about it. If we have the courage to go through this process, we liberate ourselves. But not only that, some say that when we heal ourselves, we also heal all those who came before us, our lineage, and we change the patterns for our lineage going forward. We evolve new, more constructive ways of interacting with other adults and with children. So let me give you an example of someone I work closely with. A woman was married to a wonderful and highly successful man who had been severely beaten repeatedly as a little boy by his father, who was a very well-respected pillar of the society. Whenever his wife asked about what had happened to him, her husband would speak matter-of-factly about the beatings, minimizing them by saying, well, it wasn't a big deal because he didn't really draw any blood, or justifying it by saying that he probably deserved the beatings. Her husband's older brother would later tell her how brutal those beatings actually were and how terrifying it was to see the father so out of control. Of course, the woman sympathy to her husband. But after their son was born, her husband, who had never been aggressive to her before, would explode at their little boy from time to time, and she became concerned for her young son's safety. She asked her husband to get help, but he thought this kind of behavior was normal. And anyway, he was a very successful man, so he refused. If my son didn't behave this way, he would say to his wife, then I wouldn't have to behave that way. One day he went into a fit of rage, became violent, and his wife finally threw him out of the house and wouldn't let him back in until he agreed to get help. He finally went for a week-long immersion program that educated him on child abuse and helped him access and process his childhood experiences. He got in touch for the first time with how terrifying it was for him as a little boy to have had his father beat him, how sad and betrayed he actually felt. He realized that no matter how badly a child behaves, an adult is not entitled to become violent or abusive. So getting in touch with his inner child, he came back committed to changing his pattern with his son and wife. And what happened is that their son grew up having a very close relationship with his father. And when the son had his own son decades later, the cycle of abuse had ended. So this is an example of how vulnerable children are to adopting beliefs and patterns of behavior from their caregivers. And inner child work is about bringing these to awareness and unpacking them as adults in order to heal and break cycles of abuse.
I was reading somewhere that until age 7, the brain waves are in the same brain waves, theta and delta, I believe, as hypnosis. So these little kids are like walking in hypnosis, believing everything anybody tells them.
Exactly.
And we were those little kids too.
Yes.
And so the thing is, we kind of, as parents, forget how big this parenting thing is.
Yes.
I certainly would have thought twice if I knew how hard it was going to be. I almost think that there needs to be a parenting manual or a, how instead of a driver's license, a parenting license that people need to get before they really get into this. So not everyone is a parent, but for the majority of the people who are currently parents or planning to become parents, why is this healing process so necessary before they become parents?
Well, I think you pointed it out. From everything I've studied, how we parent and more generally care for and educate our children is among the most essential and critical pieces of preventing trauma and building resilience. But also, I believe it's foundational to democratic governance and economic well-being. We usually don't make the link, but they are so linked. Listen, you can't protect babies and children from experiencing, stress, but children who are exposed to stress and then comforted by parents who are well attuned to them and well regulated, meaning they know how to manage their own reactions to stress.
Yeah.
These children can grow to be resilient. So over time, the child's survival brain and nervous system become conditioned to associate things like distress, that going outside their comfort zone, with subsequent recovery experience of being soothed afterwards. So then as the child grows, they can try new things that take them outside their comfort zone, and their survival brain and nervous system will trust that they can always come back to their parents, caregivers for soothing and support. So the years of childhood vulnerability can be incredibly strengthening if we give young people the right environment. So the right environment for children, again, is not to imagine you can get rid of all stress. It's to provide infants and children with caregivers who they can become securely attached to, and caregivers who are well attuned and well regulated. In other words, have done their own healing work and who are educated about what children need and require.
Yes, yes. I think even just stopping the pattern, right? If there were some negative things they received from their parents, just stopping that pattern to pass on to the next generation. It's important for new parents or existing parents to do this work.
And I think that it's really critical that we have to realize that the ages from 0 to about 6 or 7 are programming years. Jesuit priests knew this very well. They have a saying, give me the child for the first 7 years and I'll give you the man. So what we understand now is that during those early years, as you said, children are in this alpha theta brain states, which is the same state that a person is in when they're in hypnosis or meditation. So imagine little children walking around in a state of hypnosis, being programmed by the environment they're in, open to suggestion, and in a super learning mode.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I have jumped out of an airplane. I really have. And that I thought that was the most courageous thing I've ever done. But I think parenting is the most courageous thing I've ever done. I've done a great job. I mean, look at my daughter and my son.
And healing is even more courageous than anything. I mean, it's really opening up fully to, it's humility. It's ultimate humility of.
I agree.
So
it's that mirror. It's that mirror looking at you, looking back at you. Exactly. I think our kids are there to show us all of our strengths and weaknesses, right? And it's like, oh my God, I do that. So staying with the same theme, if we want to kind of like stop the negative patterns that were forced onto us as children, typical examples are verbal abuse, physical abuse. Surely as adults, we know that it's wrong, right? But it just seems like as we're doing our parenting, in other words, my question is, why do we do to our children what our parents did to us, even though it was wrong? Why do we do that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. When we have experienced childhood abuse, particularly at the hands of loved ones, we tend to use various psychological strategies that will help us live with these experiences. For example, we learn to deny or distort what really happened to reduce anxiety and to defend against disrupting how we view our loved ones in the world. So just imagine a child who's being hit or verbally humiliated by a parent experiences what's called cognitive dissonance. I mean, how is a child supposed to make sense and endure the reality that someone they love and are totally dependent on for their survival is hurting them, is unsafe? This tension produces unbearable anxiety. So the child unconsciously defends themselves from the reality by burying it. And there are a number of unconscious defense strategies that children typically use to protect themselves from psychological pain. These typical unconscious strategies include minimizing what was done to them. It wasn't a big deal, or they will rationalize or justify, oh, I deserve the abuse, they'll say, or they will deny that it happened. And also, they may totally dissociate from the experience, have a form of dissociative amnesia. And dissociation removes an individual's awareness from the direct experience of the event. The problem with these unconscious strategies is that while dissociating and minimizing what happened may allow the child to survive their childhood, as an adult, it sets them up for more suffering. For example, they may have anxieties that they can't explain. They have problems focusing or problems sleeping. And the other repercussion is that if you dissociated from the effects that childhood abuse had on you, or you have minimized or justified it, it makes you vulnerable to being abused again. Also, you can lack basic compassion for how others will feel if you did the same thing to them. And that's how we can inflict on our children the terrible things that were done to us, because in effect, we've lost touch with how terrible they made us feel and that we didn't deserve it in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting because sometimes the people who get abused, like you were the example you brought up, they believe they deserve to be abused. You know, it's like I was a bad kid, so I was hit, and it's no big deal. You know,
Yes.
and so it's like why is that not a big deal? And so that's a great point. You know, we're at the half hour, but I am just dying to ask one more question, Susanjan. It just seems like some circumstances take us straight back to our childhood, you know, and all of a sudden we're a little 5-year-old, you know, having a tantrum.
Yeah.
And even surprising ourselves with our tantrums, like, and creating needless suffering for ourselves and people around us. So when dealing with other people at work or at home, why do we sometimes have exaggerated childish reactions like this? And you know, how can we kind of recognize it and catch ourselves and maybe change it around?
Well, it's a big question. I'll try to answer it succinctly. It could be one of several reasons. Something in our present day may trigger an association to something that happened in the past. So it presses on an earlier wound. And we're back, we are brought to a state of fear or shame. And from that place, we act out in unproductive ways. So if something reminds us of that earlier wound that happened to us, say we were 5 years old and something happened to us, and something now we're adults and something in the work situation reminds us we're feeling left out or humiliated in some way. So we go back to that earlier wound as if we're 5 and we react from that young place. So even though as an adult, you know, though we're an adult or an adult is across from us, really what's being triggered is the wounded, fearful child. But another reason why we may act out in exaggerated ways is that when we were growing up, the adults around us acted inappropriately, and we just got socialized into thinking that having tantrums, for example, is normal. It's what a man does when he's upset, for example. That's how things are done. So it's not just that we get triggered, it's also that we've been socialized to think this is the appropriate way to react.
That this is okay. Yeah, this behavior is okay. And,
so these are the things we have to change.
And okay. So you know what? It's about 10:34. I'm going to open it out, Parisa. So can you please read out some common questions? We may or may not get to all the written questions, but pick out some good ones for Susan to answer.
Yeah, we actually did not get any questions in the chat, so I'd welcome anyone who has any to feel free to throw them in now. We can either answer a couple right now or leave a few for later.
Or we could continue until that happens. Why don't you
yes, Catherine, can you unmute Catherine so she can ask in person?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hi, Suzanne. It's good to see you.
I just want to point out that Catherine's an author and has written wonderful books and has edited Free Me to Love and gives workshops and all sorts of valuable things as well. So thank you and welcome, Catherine, for being here.
Thank you. I wanted you to respond to, I think, what I feel is an important aspect of the self-healing inner child experience. In Heal Yourself with Writing, my workshop and book, I have an exercise called the missing piece. Sometimes when you experience trauma as a child, or say you didn't get the mothering you should have or the fathering, it creates a kind of hole in you, empty space that nothing seems to fill it. And I advocate that it's necessary to you become the mother to that inner child or the father. and find ways to do it. And also, a way can be when you have children to be the mother you didn't have or whatever. So I wondered if you would add to that about how can we fill that missing piece? How can we become the parent to ourselves? Because we can't just stop. We can't just get rid of the shame. We have to do it through our love and compassion for ourselves and that child.
So beautifully said, Catherine. Thank you for your question.
Mm.
I don't know if you sent the PDF that I had given you to distribute, but in that, Catherine,
No.
I have. So we will make sure that we send it to everyone who's there. The only thing is, I do advocate to do this work not alone, because oftentimes we isolate ourselves in our healing journey.
Yes.
So even though I sent the PDF and it's something you could do on your own, I really would rather you not doing it alone. I want to give you a taste. But I really would want to encourage you to get support, either with a friend or ideally a professional who can help you through this process. But to your point, in my PDF, I have a couple of exercises. And really the journey is exactly what you said, Catherine. It's about strengthening the adult self in yourself. So when we're not healed, when we haven't done our healing work, the adult, mature self is smushed together with the child self that's wounded. And we don't often just differentiate them. But as we heal, the adult healed self becomes its own presence, and we strengthen that to hold the part of us that's wounded. That, and ironically, I'm currently, the past 2 years, been living with my mother after 30 years of being apart from her, really, caretaking her. And all my thinking, I had healed all sorts of issues, all sorts of things came to the surface. So it's been the perfect opportunity for me to see for myself still the parts of me that didn't feel loved enough, didn't feel caretaken enough. I mean, whatever. She didn't me. I know who knows what else. And I've had to really strengthen the adult part, journaling, talking to that part of myself that's young, reassuring, getting in touch with her feelings, also the young part of me, really, really knowing, separating the adult from the child and witnessing the pain of the child. So I do journaling exercises and meditation exercises where I do that work with that young part of myself and have discussions and hear her pain, what's going on. And again, the PDF has a couple of exercises that I have done. I both personally have done and done with clients. And it's a process over time of really, it's falling back in love with yourself. Here's the interesting thing. We treat our child self the way we were treated as children. So if we got mistreated as a child, we often have ignored our own child self. We diminish her, we devalue her. That part of why people don't want to do inner child work. It's like, what is that stuff? What is this whole children stuff? But it's partly because our inner child, our child, didn't get treated properly. So the adult has gotten in the habit of devaluing her. So we have to become trustworthy, and we have to fall back in love with that beautiful, innocent child again. So that's part of the process of remembering who she was. I mean, I advocate having a little picture of ourselves as a young person. And I remember years ago when I started doing this work, I couldn't stand looking at my own picture as a little girl. I mean, it was hard for me. And, you just have to learn to fall back in love with yourself. It's accessing the sweetness of that child. But I completely agree with you, Catherine. It's just this process of, first of all, differentiating and giving the child what she needs. First of all, listening to her, witnessing what she went through, and asking her, what do you need from me now? What can I do for you? And then giving that part of yourself. I mean, she may say, I want some ice cream. I want to go out and have some fun. I'm tired of you sitting in front of the computer. I want to do something joyful. So to listen and actually schedule those things and play with your own self. Those are some of the things. But I will, again, everyone will get the PDF. And any questions, please contact me and we can continue the conversation about that.
Yes, everyone will get the PDF. I didn't have the ability to send an attachment through Eventbrite, and all the emails have been going out through the Eventbrite. But I will make sure to have a follow-up email sent out to you with the PDF. And that's Susan's treasured, basically, process of how to commune with the inner self.
But again, I would prefer that you do it in tandem with working with someone else, because I don't want you to be alone. We have been so isolated and alone in our process, and it would be really wonderful if you created a community, a group, or work with a professional or some, I do this work as well, but I usually do it in the context of life coaching. So there's a dream or some aspiration, I do the inner child work if it's in the way of reaching the larger goals you have in life. But anyway,
Yes.
I don't want you doing it alone. In other words, I really want you to be held and witnessed, and that child part acknowledged for what he went through by another human being. That's part of the healing process as well.
So